Good evening, dear listener. Tonight, we return once again to the forgotten folds of history in search of moments that shaped the world in quiet ways. Whether you're cozy in bed or listening with closed eyes, I'm glad you're spending this peaceful time here. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. Are you just waking up or about to drift off with the past whispering in your ear? If you're enjoying these calm passages through time, please do subscribe. There are many more nights like this ahead. The Belle Époque period, spanning roughly from 1871 to 1914, was supposed to be France's golden age. Paris had become the cultural capital of the world, attracting artists, writers, and intellectuals from every corner of Europe. The city pulsed with innovation, creativity, and an intoxicating sense that anything was possible. But beneath this glittering surface, something darker was brewing. Literally, absinthe had arrived in Paris like a beautiful poison, seducing the creative class with promises of enhanced imagination and artistic insight. The ritual itself was mesmerizing, slowly dripping ice-cold water over a sugar cube balanced on an ornate spoon, watching as the clear green liquid transformed into an opalescent, cloudy elixir. This wasn't just drinking, it was a ceremony, a gateway to altered consciousness that seemed to unlock the deepest chambers of creativity. The numbers tell an incredible story. By the 1890s, Parisians were consuming over 36 million liters of absinthe annually. That's enough to fill nearly 15 Olympic swimming pools with this potent green spirit. 5 in the afternoon became known as l'heure verte, the green hour, when cafés across Paris would fill with the distinctive aroma of anise and wormwood as patrons performed their daily absinthe rituals. But who were these people gathering for the green hour? They weren't just casual drinkers looking for an evening buzz. These were the titans of artistic expression. Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec, who famously hollowed out his walking cane to carry absinthe wherever he went. Edgar Degas, whose paintings captured the ethereal quality of Parisian nightlife fueled by the Green Fairy. Paul Verlaine and Arthur Rimbaud, whose tempestuous relationship was as intoxicated by absinthe as it was by passion. The most fascinating aspect of absinthe culture wasn't just who drank it, but how it fundamentally altered the creative process itself. Writers reported that absinthe unlocked linguistic possibilities they never knew existed. Painters claimed colors became more vivid, more emotionally resonant. Musicians found melodies flowing from their instruments with supernatural ease. The drink seemed to dissolve the barriers between conscious thought and pure creative expression. Take Oscar Wilde, for example, who became one of absinthe's most eloquent advocates during his time in Paris. He described the experience with typical Wildean flair. After the first glass, you see things as you wish they were. After the second, you see things as they are not. Finally, you see things as they really are, which is the most horrible thing in the world. This wasn't just poetic exaggeration. Wilde was documenting a genuine psychological phenomenon that millions of Parisians were experiencing daily. The absinthe experience was unlike anything people had encountered before. Unlike wine or beer, which simply dulled the senses, absinthe seemed to sharpen certain perceptions while completely distorting others. Drinkers reported synesthesia, hearing colors, seeing sounds, experiencing a blending of sensory input that created entirely new forms of perception. This wasn't mere intoxication, it was a fundamental alteration of consciousness that seemed tailor-made for artistic exploration.
The chemical composition of authentic Belle Époque absinthe was significantly different from anything available today. The key ingredient, grand wormwood, contained high concentrations of thujone, a compound that affects the same neural pathways as cannabis, but with completely different results. Modern scientific analysis has revealed that 19th century absinthe contained thujone levels that were literally 10 times higher than anything legally produced today. But thujone was just one piece of a complex chemical puzzle. Authentic absinthe contained a botanical symphony: sweet fennel, green anise, petite wormwood, hyssop, lemon balm, angelica root, star anise, dittany, juniper, nutmeg, and veronica. Each ingredient contributed its own psychoactive properties, creating a compound effect that no single substance could achieve alone. The production process itself was almost alchemical in its complexity. Master distillers guarded their recipes like state secrets, passing down techniques through generations of carefully selected apprentices. The distillation required precise timing, exact temperatures, and an almost mystical understanding of how different botanical essences would interact during the process. What made Belle Époque absinthe particularly potent was the secondary maceration process. After the initial distillation, the clear spirit would be redistilled with additional herbs to achieve that characteristic green color. This wasn't just for aesthetics. The secondary botanicals added another layer of psychoactive compounds that intensified the overall effect. The typical absinthe of this era contained between 68 and 72% alcohol by volume, nearly twice as strong as whiskey or vodka. But the high alcohol content wasn't what made absinthe unique. It was the combination of extreme potency with psychoactive botanicals that created an entirely new category of intoxication. Café culture in Belle Époque Paris revolved around these absinthe rituals. The Café de la Nouvelle Athènes and dozens of other establishments became temples to the green fairy. Each café developed its own variation of the absinthe service, with specialized glassware, unique spoon designs, and signature water dripping techniques that became part of the establishment's identity. The social dynamics around absinthe consumption created a fascinating subculture within Parisian society. Absinthe drinkers developed their own vocabulary, their own etiquette, and their own social hierarchies. Newcomers to the absinthe scene were easily identified by their clumsy handling of the ritual, while seasoned drinkers performed the ceremony with ballet-like precision that commanded respect from fellow devotees. Women's relationship with absinthe was particularly complex and controversial. While Victorian society typically restricted women's public drinking, absinthe culture was surprisingly egalitarian. Female artists, writers, and intellectuals fully participated in café society, using absinthe as both creative fuel and social lubricant in ways that challenged traditional gender roles. The economic impact of absinthe on Parisian society was staggering. Entire industries developed around absinthe culture: specialized glassmakers creating ornate serving vessels, metal workers crafting elaborate spoons, furniture makers designing absinthe-specific café tables, and even fashion designers creating clothing that complemented the absinthe aesthetic. But perhaps most importantly, absinthe fundamentally altered the pace and rhythm of Parisian intellectual life. The traditional pattern of work, rest, and social interaction was replaced by a new cycle built around the green hour. Entire creative communities synchronized their daily routines around collective absinthe consumption, creating a shared, altered consciousness that fostered unprecedented artistic collaboration. The medical establishment of the time was completely unprepared for the phenomenon of mass absinthe consumption. Medical doctors began documenting strange new symptoms, patients reporting vivid hallucinations that persisted long after the alcohol had metabolized, creative individuals experiencing periods of superhuman productivity followed by complete psychological collapse, and an alarming increase in what physicians termed artistic madness. These weren't isolated cases or exaggerated reports from temperance advocates. Hospital records from Belle Époque Paris show a dramatic spike in admissions for what doctors classified as absinthism, a distinct medical condition that seemed to combine the worst aspects of alcoholism with entirely new forms of mental deterioration. The symptoms of chronic absinthe consumption were unlike anything medical science had previously encountered. Patients reported extreme sensitivity to light and sound, reported vivid hallucinations that persisted long after the alcohol had metabolized, and displayed cognitive patterns that alternated between brilliant clarity and complete confusion. Most disturbing of all, many patients seemed to develop a permanent alteration in their perception of reality that persisted long after they stopped drinking absinthe entirely. What doctors didn't understand at the time was that they were witnessing the first documented case of mass.
Even more disturbing was the case of Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec, whose relationship with absinthe became so extreme that friends and family staged multiple interventions. Lautrec had modified his walking cane into a portable absinthe dispenser, allowing him to maintain constant intoxication throughout his daily activities. His letters from this period reveal a mind trapped between moments of artistic brilliance and episodes of complete psychological breakdown. But here's where the story becomes truly fascinating. Despite the obvious dangers, absinthe consumption continued to skyrocket throughout the 1890s. Why would intelligent, educated people continue using a substance that was clearly destroying their mental health? The answer lies in understanding the addictive properties of absinthe that went far beyond physical dependency. Absinthe created what modern addiction specialists would recognize as psychological dependency of the most insidious kind. Users didn't just crave the substance, they became convinced that their creative abilities were impossible without it. Writers believed their words would lose their power. Painters feared their colors would become dull. Musicians worried their melodies would disappear forever if they stopped drinking the green fairy. This wasn't mere superstition. Absinthe did genuinely enhance certain cognitive functions in the short term. The thujone compounds acted as a mild stimulant, while the high alcohol content reduced inhibitions, creating a mental state that was simultaneously relaxed and hyper-alert. For creative individuals, this combination produced genuine breakthroughs in their artistic work that seemed impossible to achieve through sobriety alone. The social pressure within Parisian artistic circles made stopping even more difficult. Absinthe consumption had become so integrated into creative culture that abstaining was seen as intellectual cowardice. Artists who tried to quit were often ostracized from café society, losing not just their social connections, but their professional networks and collaborative opportunities. The government's response to the growing absinthe crisis reveals just how deeply the substance had penetrated French society. Initial attempts at regulation were met with fierce resistance, not just from drinkers, but from café owners, distillers, and even medical professionals who argued that absinthe was essential to French cultural identity. The French Academy of Medicine commissioned the first comprehensive study of absinthism in 1901, led by Dr. Valentine Magnin, whose research would eventually change everything. Magnin's experiments on laboratory animals revealed that absinthe produced brain lesions and behavioral changes that were distinctly different from those caused by alcohol alone. His findings suggested that the botanical compounds in absinthe were neurotoxic in ways that pure alcohol was not. But Magnin's most shocking discovery came from studying the brains of deceased absinthe users.
Autopsy results showed consistent patterns of brain damage in the frontal cortex, the region responsible for executive function and impulse control. These weren't the typical changes associated with alcoholism, but rather specific types of neural deterioration that seemed to be caused by the unique chemical composition of absinthe. The international medical community was stunned by these findings. Here was scientific proof that absinthe wasn't just another alcoholic beverage, but rather a genuinely dangerous psychoactive substance that could cause permanent brain damage. Countries across Europe began conducting their own studies, and the results were consistently alarming. Switzerland, where absinthe had originated, became the first country to completely ban the substance in 1910 after a particularly horrific incident known as the Landfray murders. John Lamfray, a Swiss farmer and chronic absinthe user, killed his pregnant wife and 2 daughters during what witnesses described as an absinthe-induced psychotic episode. The case became international news and galvanized the growing anti-absinthe movement across Europe. But in France, the cultural attachment to absinthe ran much deeper than mere recreational drinking. Absinthe had become intertwined with French national identity, particularly the romantic notion of the tortured artist, whose suffering produced transcendent art. The idea that this suffering might be artificially induced by a toxic substance challenged fundamental assumptions about creativity, authenticity, and the price of artistic genius. The debate over absinthe revealed deep philosophical divisions within French intellectual society. Conservative critics argued that absinthe was destroying the moral fabric of the nation, turning productive citizens into delusional addicts who contributed nothing to society beyond their own artistic indulgence. Progressive defenders countered that absinthe was liberating human consciousness from the constraints of bourgeois conformity, allowing artists to access higher planes of creative expression. The economic implications of a potential absinthe ban were staggering. The absinthe industry employed thousands of workers in distilleries, bottling plants, and distribution networks. Café owners argued that banning absinthe would destroy their businesses, since the elaborate rituals and extended consumption periods associated with absinthe drinking generated far more revenue than simple beer or wine service. Perhaps most importantly, absinthe had become the defining element of what the world saw as quintessentially Parisian culture. Tourists flocked to Paris specifically to experience the mystique of absinthe cafés, and the Green Ferry had become as much a symbol of French sophistication as the Eiffel Tower or the Louvre. Banning absinthe would mean abandoning one of France's most powerful cultural exports. The artistic community's response to the growing anti-absinthe movement was swift and passionate. Manifesto after manifesto appeared in Parisian newspapers, signed by dozens of prominent writers, painters, and intellectuals who argued that absinthe was essential to their creative process. They claimed that any attempt to regulate or ban the substance would represent government censorship of artistic expression itself. Some of the era's most celebrated artists organized absinthe defense societies that held public demonstrations and published elaborate defenses of their right to consume whatever substances they believed enhanced their creativity. These weren't just social gatherings, but rather organized political movements that viewed the absinthe debate as part of a larger struggle between individual freedom and state control. The most articulate defender of absinthe was surprisingly Oscar Wilde, whose eloquent essays on the subject became rallying cries for the pro-absinthe movement. Wilde argued that absinthe represented humanity's eternal quest to transcend the limitations of ordinary consciousness, and that banning it would be equivalent to outlawing poetry, music, and art itself. But even as artists defended their right to consume absinthe, the evidence of its destructive effects continued to mount. Hospital admission rates for absinthism were climbing exponentially, and the symptoms were becoming increasingly severe and bizarre. Doctors began documenting cases that defied all previous medical understanding. Patients were arriving at hospitals claiming they could see music as geometric patterns floating through the air, or that colors had developed distinct personalities that spoke to them in whispers. One particularly disturbing case involved a prominent sculptor who became convinced that his hands were slowly dissolving, even though physical examination revealed no abnormalities whatsoever. The medical journals of the period read like collections of supernatural horror stories rather than scientific documents. Dr. Auguste Morel published a comprehensive study in 1902 that cataloged over 300 distinct symptoms associated with chronic absinthe consumption. His patients reported experiences that seemed to exist in a twilight zone between hallucination and reality. Shadows that moved independently of their sources, conversations with deceased relatives who appeared as vivid as living people, and the persistent sensation that their thoughts were being broadcast aloud for everyone to hear. What made these cases particularly unsettling was their consistency across different social classes and geographic regions. Wealthy Parisian intellectuals were experiencing identical symptoms to working-class laborers who had access to cheaper, more adulterated versions of absinthe. This suggested that the core psychoactive compounds in absinthe were producing predictable neurological effects regardless of the drinker's background or the specific brand they consumed. The most systematic investigation into absinthe's effects came from Dr. Emil Kraepelin in Germany, who conducted controlled experiments comparing alcohol intoxication with absinthe consumption. His findings were revolutionary for their time and remain relevant to modern neuroscience. Kraepelin discovered that absinthe produced a unique form of intoxication characterized by heightened sensory perception combined with severely impaired judgment and impulse control. Kraepelin's subjects consistently reported that absinthe made colors appear more saturated, sounds more crisp and detailed, and textures more pronounced. However, these enhanced perceptions came at a devastating cost to their cognitive functioning. Simple mathematical calculations became impossible, basic social interactions turned chaotic and inappropriate, and subjects frequently engaged in dangerous behaviors that they would never consider while sober or even heavily intoxicated with alcohol alone. The neurological mechanism behind these effects remained mysterious until Kraepelin began examining.
What he found challenged everything the medical community thought they knew about psychoactive substances. The thujone compounds in absinthe were binding to specific receptor sites in the brain that controlled both sensory processing and executive function, creating a neurochemical storm that enhanced perception while simultaneously destroying the brain's ability to interpret those enhanced perceptions rationally. This discovery explained why absinthe users often produced brilliant creative work during the early stages of their consumption, only to descend into complete madness as their usage increased. The same neurochemical processes that enhanced artistic perception were gradually destroying the brain structures responsible for maintaining contact with reality. The French government found itself in an impossible position. The scientific evidence against absinthe was becoming overwhelming, but the cultural and economic forces supporting it were equally powerful. President Émile Loubet privately acknowledged that absinthe posed a genuine public health crisis, but publicly maintained that any regulation would require extensive study and consultation with affected industries. Behind closed doors, government officials were receiving increasingly alarming reports from police departments across Paris. Violent crimes involving absinthe users were becoming almost routine, and these weren't typical alcohol-fueled brawls. Absinthe-related violence displayed patterns of extreme brutality and bizarre irrationality that suggested the perpetrators were operating in completely altered states of consciousness. The most notorious case involved Vincent Carrel, a respected bank clerk who had no previous history of violence or mental illness. After consuming approximately 8 glasses of absinthe during a single evening, Carrel became convinced that his neighbors were plotting to poison his water supply. He systematically murdered 3 families in his apartment building before police could subdue him, and during his trial, he maintained that he had been protecting innocent people from a conspiracy that only he could perceive.
Carrel's case became a rallying point for both sides of the absinthe debate. Prohibitionists argued that his actions proved absinthe turned ordinary citizens into dangerous lunatics who posed an existential threat to public safety. Defenders countered that Carrel was clearly mentally unstable before his absinthe consumption, and that blaming the substance for his actions was equivalent to blaming wine for every crime committed by intoxicated individuals. The scientific community was split along similar lines. Conservative physicians called for immediate prohibition based on mounting evidence of absinthe's neurotoxic effects. Progressive doctors argued that moderate consumption could be safe and beneficial, and that the real problem was adulterated absinthe, produced by unregulated distilleries using dangerous industrial chemicals to achieve the characteristic green color and bitter taste. This distinction between authentic and counterfeit absinthe became crucial to understanding the full scope of the crisis. Laboratory analysis revealed that many commercial absinthe contained compounds that had nothing to do with traditional botanical ingredients. Cheap producers were using copper sulfate for coloring, antimony chloride for the clouding effect, and various industrial solvents to approximate the complex flavor profile of genuine wormwood distillation. These adulterants were often more dangerous than the absinthe itself. Copper sulfate poisoning caused symptoms that perfectly mimicked the worst effects of absinthism: violent hallucinations, uncontrollable tremors, and progressive neurological deterioration. Antimony chloride attacks the central nervous system in ways that create permanent brain damage indistinguishable from the effects attributed to thujone. The revelation that much of what people thought was absinthe poisoning was actually heavy metal toxicity complicated the regulatory debate enormously. Prohibitionists argued that the widespread adulteration proved that absinthe could never be safely regulated, since consumers had no way to distinguish authentic products from dangerous counterfeits. Industry defenders maintained that proper regulation and quality control could eliminate the adulterant problem while preserving access to genuine absinthe for responsible consumers. Meanwhile, the cultural impact of absinthe continued to expand beyond its original artistic circles. Middle-class Parisians began incorporating absinthe rituals into their social routines, viewing the elaborate preparation ceremony as a mark of sophistication and worldliness. Department stores began selling absinthe service sets as wedding gifts, complete with engraved glasses, ornate spoons, and detailed instruction manuals for proper preparation technique. This mainstream adoption of absinthe culture created new social dynamics that further complicated the regulatory debate. Unlike the bohemian artists who had originally embraced absinthe as a tool for creative expression, middle-class consumers were primarily interested in the social status and aesthetic appeal of absinthe consumption. They were less likely to develop the extreme dependency patterns seen among heavy users, but their numbers were vastly larger, creating a much broader base of political opposition to any prohibition efforts. The international dimension of the absinthe crisis was becoming increasingly important as well. American temperance activists had begun citing French absinthe consumption as evidence that European moral degeneracy was spreading globally. British medical journals published sensationalized accounts of Parisian absinthism as cautionary tales about the dangers of unregulated alcohol policy. German and Italian authorities implemented their own studies of absinthe effects, generally confirming the French findings, but reaching different conclusions about appropriate regulatory responses. The Swiss ban had created an interesting natural experiment in absinthe prohibition. Cross-border smuggling flourished immediately, with French and Italian producers developing sophisticated distribution networks to supply Swiss consumers who refused to give up their traditional drink. Black market absinthe was often more dangerous than legal varieties, since smugglers had strong incentives to use the cheapest possible ingredients and production methods. More importantly, the Swiss ban had virtually no impact on consumption patterns in neighboring regions. French absinthe producers simply redirected their Swiss exports to other markets, while Swiss consumers crossed borders regularly to maintain their drinking habits. This suggested that national prohibition might be ineffective unless implemented simultaneously across multiple countries. The economic arguments against absinthe prohibition were becoming more sophisticated as well. Industry representatives commissioned detailed studies showing that absinthe-related businesses employed over 50,000 people directly, with perhaps twice that number dependent on the industry indirectly, through suppliers, distributors, and service providers. The tax revenue generated by absinthe sales represented a significant portion of municipal budgets in major cities, funding everything from public works projects to educational initiatives. Cafe owners presented particularly compelling argument about the cultural and economic importance of absinthe service. The elaborate rituals and extended consumption periods associated with absinthe drinking created a unique form of social space that had become central to Parisian intellectual life. Writers, artists, and political activists conducted much of their collaborative work in absinthe cafes, using the shared altered consciousness produced by the drink to facilitate creative and intellectual breakthroughs that would have been impossible in conventional social settings. The feminist implications of the absinthe debate were largely ignored by contemporary observers, but became increasingly important as women's participation in cafe culture expanded. Traditional gender roles severely limited women's access to public social spaces, but absinthe cafes operated according to more egalitarian principles that allowed female intellectuals and artists to participate fully in public intellectual discourse. Women's absinthe consumption patterns differed significantly from men's, both in terms of quantity and social context. Female absinthe users were more likely to consume the drink as part of structured social activities rather than solitary creative work, and they showed lower rates of dependency and extreme symptomatology. However, when women did develop serious absinthe problems, the social consequences were often more severe due to prevailing attitudes about feminine propriety and maternal responsibility. The medical establishment was particularly concerned about absinthe consumption among pregnant women, though their understanding of fetal development was limited by the scientific knowledge available at the time. Doctors observed that women who consumed absinthe regularly during pregnancy were more likely to deliver infants with developmental abnormalities, but they couldn't distinguish between the effects of absinthe itself, alcohol in general, or the various adulterants found in commercial products. These concerns about reproductive health provided prohibition advocates with some of their most emotionally compelling arguments. The idea that absinthe consumption might be damaging unborn children resonated strongly with conservative politicians and religious leaders who viewed the drink as a threat to family stability and social order. The artistic community's response to these health concerns was complex and often contradictory. Many prominent artists acknowledged that absinthe posed serious risks to both individual users and society as a whole, but they argued that artistic creation necessarily involved risk and sacrifice.
The romantic notion of the tortured artist whose suffering produced transcendent beauty had become so deeply embedded in cultural assumptions about creativity that many people genuinely believed that eliminating absinthe would somehow diminish the quality and authenticity of French artistic production. This philosophical tension between individual artistic freedom and collective social responsibility would ultimately determine the outcome of the absinthe debate. As evidence of the drink's dangers continued to accumulate, French society was forced to confront fundamental questions about the relationship between creativity, consciousness, and civic duty that had no easy answers. The year 1905 marked a turning point in public opinion about absinthe, as a series of highly publicized incidents involving absinthe users began to shift popular sentiment toward prohibition. The most influential case involved Marie Besnard, a respected schoolteacher who had been consuming absinthe regularly for 3 years as a treatment for what she believed were nervous disorders. Besnard's descent into absinthism was particularly tragic because it was so well documented. Her detailed diary entries, discovered after her death, provided an unprecedented first-hand account of how absinthe gradually destroyed a rational, educated mind. The early entries described the drink's beneficial effects on her anxiety and creative thinking, but as her consumption increased, the entries became increasingly erratic and paranoid, ultimately degenerating into incomprehensible fragments that revealed a mind in complete psychological collapse. Besnard's final diary entries read like messages from another dimension entirely. She described conversations with historical figures who appeared in her classroom during lessons, elaborate conspiracies involving her fellow teachers who she believed were replacing students with identical imposters, and a growing conviction that the green color of absinthe was actually a living entity that was gradually taking control of her thoughts and actions. The most disturbing aspect of Besnard's ace was how long she managed to maintain her professional responsibilities, even as her grip on reality deteriorated. Her students and colleagues noticed nothing unusual until the final weeks before her complete breakdown, when she began incorporating her hallucinations into her teaching. She would interrupt mathematics lessons to point out historical figures standing in the corners of the classroom, or pause during geography instruction to warn students about the dangers of traveling to countries that existed only in her absinthe-fueled delusions. When Besnard finally collapsed during a parent-teacher conference, raving about invisible armies marching through the school hallways, the attending physician discovered that she had been consuming nearly 2 liters of absinthe daily for months. Her autopsy revealed brain damage consistent with the patterns Dr. Magnan had identified in his laboratory studies, providing concrete medical evidence that absinthe could transform a stable, intelligent individual into a dangerous psychotic. The Besnard case became front-page news across France, sparking intense public debate about the wisdom of allowing unlimited access to such a powerful psychoactive substance. Parents demanded to know how many other teachers might be secretly consuming absinthe, while education officials struggled to develop policies for identifying and addressing substance abuse among faculty members. More significantly, the Besnard case demonstrated that absinthe dangers extended far beyond the bohemian artistic circles, where most people assumed the problems were contained. Here was evidence that respectable middle-class professionals could fall victim to absinthism just as completely as the stereotypical tortured artists who frequented Montmartre cafés. The psychological mechanism behind absinthe's addictive properties was becoming clearer as more case studies accumulated. Unlike alcohol, which primarily affected judgment and motor control, absinthe seemed to target the brain's reality testing functions, while leaving other cognitive abilities relatively intact. This created a particularly insidious form of dependency, where users maintained their intellectual capabilities even as their perception of the world became increasingly distorted. Dr. Marcel Briand, who had been studying absinthism for nearly a decade, published a comprehensive analysis in 1906 that revolutionized medical understanding of the condition. Briand had interviewed over 400 chronic absinthe users, documenting their experiences with scientific precision that revealed disturbing patterns in how the substance affected human consciousness. According to Briand's research, absinthe dependency developed in predictable stages that were remarkably consistent across different users. The first stage, which he termed enhancement, typically lasted 6 months to 2 years and was characterized by improved creative output, heightened sensory perception, and increased social confidence. During this phase, users experienced genuine benefits from absinthe consumption that reinforced their belief in the substance's positive effects. The second stage, distortion, marked the beginning of serious problems, as users required increasing quantities of absinthe to achieve the same effects. Reality began to bend and shift in subtle ways that users initially interpreted as expanded consciousness rather than psychological deterioration. Colors became unnaturally vivid, sounds carried emotional weight that seemed profoundly meaningful, and ordinary objects appeared to possess hidden significance that only absinthe could reveal. The third stage, dissociation, involved complete breaks from consensus reality that could last for hours or days. Users reported traveling to alternate dimensions, communicating with supernatural entities, and experiencing time as a fluid, malleable substance that could be manipulated through concentrated thought. What made this stage particularly dangerous was that users often retained enough cognitive function to appear relatively normal during brief social interactions, masking the severity of their condition from friends and family. The final stage, dissolution, represented complete psychological collapse as users lost the ability to distinguish between their absinthe-induced experiences and ordinary reality. At this point, intervention was often impossible because users had developed elaborate delusional systems that incorporated any attempt at treatment into their distorted worldview. Briand's staging system explained why so many intelligent, educated people continued using absinthe despite obvious signs of deterioration. The enhancement phase created genuine positive experiences that users desperately wanted to recapture, while the gradual nature of the decline made it difficult to recognize when recreational use had become pathological dependency. The international medical community embraced Briand's research as the definitive explanation for absinthism, but the artistic establishment rejected his findings as reductive materialism that failed to account for the genuine creative insights that absinthe provided. This philosophical divide reflected deeper tensions within French society about the nature of consciousness, creativity, and the proper relationship between individual freedom and collective responsibility. The debate intensified when several prominent artists published their own accounts of absinthe use that directly contradicted medical characterizations of the substance as purely destructive. Paul Gauguin wrote extensively about how absinthe had enabled him to perceive colors and forms that existed beyond ordinary visual experience, leading to artistic breakthroughs that would have been impossible through conventional consciousness alone. Similarly, Stéphane Mallam argued that absinthe dissolved the artificial boundaries between subject and object, self and world, that prevented most people from accessing the fundamental unity underlying all existence. From this perspective, what doctors interpreted as hallucinations and delusions were actually glimpses of deeper truths about the nature of reality itself. These artistic testimonials carried enormous cultural weight because they came from individuals whose creative achievements were undeniably significant. How could medical authorities claim that absinthe was purely destructive when it contributed to some of the era's most celebrated artistic works? The answer, according to Dr. Briand and his colleagues, lay in understanding the difference between short-term creative enhancement and long-term psychological damage. Absinthe might indeed facilitate creative breakthroughs during the early stages of use, but these benefits inevitably gave way to progressive mental deterioration that ultimately destroyed the very creativity it had initially enhanced. This temporal dimension of absinthe's effects became crucial to the regulatory debate. Prohibition advocates argued that no creative benefits could justify the inevitable psychological destruction that followed prolonged use, while defenders maintained that the choice between enhanced creativity and conventional consciousness should remain with individual artists rather than government bureaucrats. The economic stakes continued to escalate as the debate intensified. Absinthe production had become one of France's most profitable export industries, with premium brands commanding extraordinary prices in international markets. The distinct
Related establishments employed over 100,000 people directly or indirectly, making prohibition economically devastating for working-class communities that depended on the hospitality industry. The labor unions representing distillery workers, café employees, and glass manufacturers united in opposition to prohibition, viewing the anti-absinthe movement as an attack on working-class livelihoods disguised as public health advocacy. They organized massive demonstrations in Paris and other major cities, demanding that any regulatory changes include provisions for retraining and economic support for displaced workers. These economic arguments resonated strongly with politicians who understood that absinthe prohibition could trigger widespread unemployment and social unrest.
The substance had become so deeply integrated into French economic life that eliminating it would require massive government intervention to prevent economic collapse in affected regions. The international dimension of the absinthe crisis was also becoming more complex, as other European countries grappled with similar problems. Belgium had implemented strict quality controls that seemed to reduce the incidence of severe absinthism without completely banning the substance, while Germany had opted for high taxation that made absinthe consumption prohibitively expensive for most citizens. Italy took a different approach entirely, treating absinthe as a controlled pharmaceutical substance that could only be purchased with medical prescriptions. This policy effectively ended recreational use while preserving access for individuals who claimed legitimate medical need for the substance's therapeutic properties. The diversity of regulatory approaches across Europe created a natural experiment that provided valuable data about the effectiveness of different policy interventions. French officials studied these international experiences carefully, looking for models that might balance public health concerns with economic and cultural considerations. What emerged from these international comparisons was that prohibition was neither necessary nor sufficient to address absinthe-related problems. Countries with strict quality control and moderate taxation had achieved significant reductions in problematic use without destroying their absinthe industries, while complete prohibition had simply driven consumption underground without eliminating demand. These findings suggested that France might be able to address the absinthe crisis through comprehensive regulation rather than outright prohibition, preserving the cultural and economic benefits of absinthe while minimizing its public health risks. However, the political momentum behind prohibition continued to build as more horrific cases of absinthism captured public attention. The spring of 1907 brought a series of incidents that seemed to demonstrate that moderate regulation would be insufficient to protect public safety. The most shocking case involved the Dubois family massacre in Lyon, where André Dubois killed his wife, 3 children, and 2 neighbors during what witnesses described as an absinthe-fueled rampage that lasted nearly 6 hours. Police reports described a scene of unimaginable brutality that suggested Dubois had been operating in a completely altered state of consciousness throughout the attack. What made the Dubois case particularly disturbing was that he had been considered a model citizen with no history of violence or mental illness. Friends and neighbors described him as a devoted family man and respected craftsman who had been consuming absinthe regularly for only 18 months before the massacre occurred. The rapid transformation from respected citizen to mass murderer seemed to confirm the most alarming claims about absinthe's psychological effects. If an ordinary person could become a homicidal maniac in less than 2 years of regular consumption, then no level of regulation could adequately protect public safety. The Dubois case became a turning point in public opinion, as even moderate voices began calling for immediate prohibition. The horrific nature of the crimes, combined with their apparent connection to absinthe consumption, created irresistible political pressure for decisive government action. Religious leaders who had previously focused their criticism on absinthe's moral implications began framing the issue in terms of public safety and civic responsibility. The Catholic Church issued official statements declaring absinthe consumption a mortal sin that threatened not just individual souls, but the stability of Christian civilization itself. Conservative politicians seized on these religious pronouncements to build broader coalitions supporting prohibition. They argued that absinthe represented a foreign influence that was corrupting traditional French values and destroying the social foundations that had made France great. Liberal politicians found themselves in an increasingly difficult position as evidence of absinthe's dangers continued to accumulate. Their traditional commitment to individual freedom and limited government intervention conflicted with growing demands for protective regulation of a genuinely dangerous substance. The artistic community's response to the Dubois case revealed deep divisions within creative circles about the proper relationship between art and social responsibility. Some prominent artists began publicly acknowledging that absinthe creative benefits could not justify its social costs, while others doubled down on their defense of absolute artistic freedom. Auguste Rodin surprised many observers by publishing an essay calling for voluntary abstinence from absinthe by all serious artists, arguing that true creativity required complete mental clarity rather than artificial enhancement. His position carried enormous weight because of his reputation as one of the era's greatest sculptors and his previous advocacy for artistic freedom. Conversely, painters like Henri Toulouse-Lautrec became even more vocal in their defense of absinthe, framing their resistance as a form of civil disobedience against cultural oppression. These competing visions of artistic responsibility reflected broader tensions within French society about the proper balance between individual freedom and collective welfare. The absinthe debate had evolved beyond questions of public health or economic policy to become a fundamental contest over the values that should guide modern civilization. The scientific evidence continued to support prohibition as researchers developed more sophisticated methods for studying absinthe's effects on human consciousness. Dr. Pierre Janet, working at the Salpêtrière Hospital, conducted the first controlled experiments comparing absinthe intoxication with other forms of altered consciousness, including hypnosis, morphine addiction, and various forms of mental illness. Janet's research revealed that absinthe produced a unique form of consciousness alteration that combined elements of stimulant intoxication, hallucinogenic experience, and dissociative episodes. This combination created psychological states that were unlike anything produced by other known substances, explaining why absinthe users developed such distinctive symptom patterns. More importantly, Janet's work demonstrated that absinthe's effects on consciousness were not simply temporary alterations that disappeared when the substance was metabolized. Chronic users showed permanent changes in brain structure and function that persisted long after they stopped consuming the substance, suggesting that absinthe caused irreversible neurological damage. These findings provided the strongest scientific justification yet for prohibition, as they indicated that even moderate absinthe use could cause cumulative brain damage that would eventually manifest as severe psychological problems. The implications were particularly alarming for occasional users who believed they could avoid absinthe's dangers through careful moderation. Janet's research also explained why absinthe withdrawal was so difficult and why relapse rates were extraordinarily high among users who attempted to quit. The neurological changes caused by chronic consumption created permanent alterations in brain chemistry that made normal consciousness feel incomplete and unsatisfying compared to the enhanced awareness that absinthe provided. The medical establishment embraced Janet's findings as definitive proof that absinthe posed unacceptable risks to public health. Professional medical associations across Europe issued joint statements calling for immediate prohibition of all absinthe production and distribution, arguing that no level of regulation could adequately protect consumers from the substance's inherent dangers. However, the absinthe industry responded with its own scientific studies that challenged the medical consensus. Industry-funded researchers argued that the most severe cases of absinthism involve consumption of adulterated products containing dangerous industrial chemicals rather than authentic absinthe made from traditional botanical ingredients. These industry studies revealed that many commercial absinthes contained levels of copper, antimony, and other toxic metals that far exceeded any reasonable safety standards. The researchers argued that eliminating these adulterants through strict quality control would address the public health concerns without necessarily destroying legitimate businesses. The debate over authentic versus adulterated absinthe became increasingly important as regulators struggled to develop policies that would protect public health without unnecessarily destroying legitimate businesses. Laboratory analyses revealed enormous variations in the chemical composition of different brands, with some products containing virtually no toxic compounds, while others were loaded with dangerous impurities.
no wormwood extract, while others exceeded safe thujone levels by factors of 10 or more. This variability suggested that consumers had no reliable way to distinguish between relatively safe products and potentially lethal ones, creating an impossible situation for regulatory authorities who wanted to allow continued access to authentic absinthe while eliminating dangerous counterfeits. The complexity of the adulteration problem was further complicated by the fact that many of the most prestigious absinthe brands contain some level of artificial additives that enhance their color, flavor, or psychoactive effects. Even products marketed as completely natural often contain synthetic compounds that had been added to improve their commercial appeal. The Swiss experience with prohibition had demonstrated that black market absinthe was often more dangerous than legal varieties, as illegal producers had strong incentives to use the cheapest possible ingredients, regardless of safety considerations. This suggested that complete prohibition might actually increase rather than decrease the public health risks associated with absinthe consumption. French authorities found themselves caught between competing pressures from medical professionals calling for immediate prohibition, economic interests demanding continued legal production, and international observers who were closely watching France's handling of what had become a global policy challenge. The government's response would ultimately depend on resolving fundamental questions about the proper role of state authority in regulating individual behavior, the relationship between scientific evidence and political decision-making, and the cultural significance of substances that had become deeply embedded in national identity. As 1908 began, the absinthe crisis had reached a critical juncture where political action could no longer be delayed. The accumulating evidence of the substance's dangers, combined with growing public pressure for government intervention, created conditions where decisive policy changes were inevitable, regardless of the economic and cultural costs involved. The pressure for action intensified dramatically when a series of medical conferences in early 1908 presented unprecedented documentation of absinthe's neurological effects. Dr. Charles Richet, who would later win the Nobel Prize in Physiology, presented brain tissue samples from chronic absinthe users that showed cellular damage patterns never before observed in medical science. The neurons appear to have literally dissolved in certain regions, creating holes in brain tissue that explain the bizarre behavioral changes doctors had been documenting. What made Richet's findings particularly compelling was his use of new staining techniques that allowed microscopic examination of individual brain cells. The damage wasn't distributed randomly throughout the brain, but concentrated specifically in areas responsible for reality testing, impulse control, and emotional regulation. This selective destruction explained why absinthe users could maintain their intellectual capabilities while simultaneously losing their grip on sanity. The visual evidence was undeniable. When Richet projected enlarged photographs of damaged brain tissue onto screens during his presentations, even the most skeptical observers were forced to confront the physical reality of what absinthe was doing to human minds. These weren't abstract theories about psychological effects, but concrete proof of organic brain destruction that could be seen and measured. The international medical community was stunned by the severity of the neurological damage. Dr. Emile Craraplain, whose earlier research had established the scientific foundation for understanding absinthe effects, declared that the substance was more dangerous than any psychoactive compound previously studied. He compared the brain damage patterns to those seen in advanced cases of syphilis or severe head trauma, conditions that inevitably led to complete mental collapse. These medical revelations coincided with a dramatic escalation in public incidents involving absinthe users. The winter of 1908 brought an epidemic of violent crimes that seemed to confirm the most alarming predictions about the substance's dangers.
Police departments across France reported that absinthe-related arrests had increased by over 300% in just 2 years, with the crimes becoming increasingly bizarre and unpredictable. The case that finally broke public tolerance involved Marguerite Steinheil, a prominent socialite whose absinthe-fueled behavior had become the subject of scandalous gossip throughout Parisian high society. Steinheil had been consuming absinthe regularly for 4 years, initially as a fashionable affectation that demonstrated her sophisticated artistic sensibilities. Friends described her early absinthe use as charming and theatrical, involving elaborate ceremonies that showcased her collection of antique glasses and ornate serving spoons. However, Steinheil's relationship with absinthe gradually became darker and more compulsive. She began hosting increasingly strange dinner parties where guests were required to participate in group absinthe consumption rituals that lasted for hours. Attendees reported that these gatherings took on an almost religious intensity, with Steinheil delivering rambling monologues about the spiritual significance of the Green Fairy while performing bizarre ceremonial preparations. The situation reached its climax during a dinner party in February 1908, when Steinheil became convinced that her guests were actually demons disguised as human beings who had come to steal her soul. She attacked 3 prominent politicians with kitchen knives, severely injuring 2 before being subdued by other guests. During the struggle, she repeatedly screamed that the Green Fairy had revealed the true demonic nature of everyone around her. Steinheil's breakdown was particularly shocking because of her social prominence and previous reputation for intelligence and sophistication. Here was a woman who had been educated in the finest schools, who spoke 5 languages fluently, and who had been considered one of the most cultured hostesses in Paris. The idea that absinthe could transform such a person into a violent psychotic terrified the upper classes, who had previously viewed the substance as a harmless indulgence. The medical examination of Steinheil after her arrest revealed the full extent of absinthe's destructive effects on her brain. Dr. Joseph Babinski, one of France's leading neurologists, conducted extensive tests that documented severe impairment in virtually every cognitive function. Steinheil could no longer perform simple arithmetic, recognize familiar faces, or maintain coherent conversations for more than a few minutes at a time. Most disturbing of all, Steinheil showed no awareness that her mental capacities had deteriorated. When asked about her mathematical abilities, she confidently attempted calculations that were completely wrong, but insisted her answers were correct. When shown photographs of her own family members, she claimed they were strangers trying to deceive her about their identities. Her brain had been so damaged that she had lost the ability to recognize her own cognitive limitations. The Steinheil case became front-page news across Europe, sparking intense debate about whether absinthe posed an existential threat to civilized society itself. If the substance could destroy the mind of an educated, wealthy woman with access to the finest medical care, then no one could consider themselves safe from its effects. Religious leaders seized on the case as evidence that absinthe represented a spiritual as well as physical danger. Cardinal Richard of Paris delivered a sermon describing absinthe as Satan's sacrament, a substance that opened the human soul to demonic possession by destroying the rational faculties that normally protected people from evil influences. This religious interpretation resonated powerfully with conservative Catholics who viewed the absinthe crisis as part of a broader assault on Christian civilization. The feminist implications of the Steinheil case were largely ignored by contemporary observers, but they added another layer of complexity to the regulatory debate. Women's absinthe consumption had been increasing rapidly as café culture became more socially acceptable for respectable ladies. The idea that absinthe could transform refined women into violent criminals challenged fundamental assumptions about feminine nature and raised uncomfortable questions about gender roles in modern society. The economic pressure for prohibition continued to build as insurance companies began refusing to provide coverage for businesses that served absinthe or individuals who were known to consume it regularly. Lloyd's of London, which insured many French commercial enterprises, announced that absinthe-related claims had become so frequent and expensive that they were no longer commercially viable to cover. This insurance crisis created immediate financial problems for café owners, distillers, and anyone else whose livelihood depended on the absinthe trade. Banks became reluctant to provide loans to absinthe-related businesses, and investors began withdrawing support from companies that had significant exposure to the industry. The economic foundation of absinthe culture was crumbling even before formal prohibition was enacted. The international diplomatic implications of France's absinthe crisis were becoming increasingly important as other nations pressured the French government to take decisive action. The United States had already banned absinthe importation, citing public
disappeared. French diplomatic officials worried that continued inaction on absinthe would damage France's international reputation and potentially lead to trade restrictions that could harm other French exports. The country that had given the world champagne, cognac, and wine was in danger of becoming synonymous with a substance that was increasingly viewed as a public menace. The artistic community's response to these mounting pressures revealed deep divisions that had been building for years. A group of prominent writers and painters published a manifesto calling for voluntary abstinence from absinthe by all serious artists, arguing that the substance had become a distraction from genuine creative work. They claimed that absinthe's reputation for enhancing creativity was largely mythical, and that the most celebrated artistic achievements of the Belle Époque had been produced despite, not because of, absinthe consumption. This artistic rebellion against absinthe culture was led by figures like André Gide, who had experimented with the substance in his youth, but had grown increasingly concerned about its effects on his fellow writers. Gide argued that absinthe created an illusion of enhanced creativity, while actually diminishing the sustained attention and disciplined effort that genuine artistic achievement required. However, other prominent artists remained staunchly committed to defending absinthe as essential to their creative process. Pablo Picasso, who was just beginning to establish his reputation in Parisian artistic circles, declared that attempts to regulate absinthe represented bourgeois fear of authentic artistic expression. He organized a group of younger artists who viewed the anti-absinthe movement as an attack on the bohemian lifestyle that had made Paris the cultural capital of the world. The generational divide within the artistic community reflected broader social tensions about the direction of French culture. Older artists who had witnessed absinthe's destructive effects firsthand were more willing to accept regulation, while younger artists who had grown up with absinthe as part of the cultural landscape viewed any restrictions as intolerable constraints on their creative freedom. The scientific debate over absinthe's effects reached a new level of sophistication as researchers developed better methods for studying the substance's impact on human consciousness. Dr. Gore Guinan at the Salpêtrière Hospital conducted the first longitudinal study of absinthe users, following the same individuals over several years to document how their symptoms progressed over time. Guinan's research revealed that absinthe's effects followed predictable patterns that were remarkably consistent across different users. The initial enhancement phase typically lasted 12 to 18 months, during which users experienced genuine improvements in creativity, social confidence, and sensory perception. However, these benefits inevitably gave way to more problematic symptoms as tolerance developed and consumption increased. The transition from enhancement to deterioration was often so gradual that users didn't recognize what was happening until significant brain damage had already occurred. Guinan documented cases where highly intelligent individuals continued to function normally in professional settings, while experiencing increasingly severe hallucinations and paranoid delusions in their private lives.
This hidden nature of absinthe's progression made the substance particularly dangerous because users could maintain the appearance of normalcy long after their mental faculties had begun to deteriorate. By the time friends and family members recognized that something was seriously wrong, the neurological damage was often irreversible. Guinan's findings explained why so many absinthe users violently resisted attempts at intervention or treatment. Their damaged brains could no longer accurately assess their own condition, leading them to interpret genuine concern from others as persecution or conspiracy. This neurological inability to recognize their own impairment made traditional addiction treatment approaches completely ineffective. The pharmaceutical industry began developing potential treatments for absinthism. As the medical understanding of the condition improved, several companies invested heavily in research aimed at finding compounds that could reverse or halt the neurological damage caused by chronic absinthe consumption. These efforts were driven partly by humanitarian concerns, but also by the enormous potential profits that would come from successfully treating the thousands of absinthe users across Europe. However, early treatment attempts proved largely unsuccessful. The brain damage caused by absinthe appeared to be irreversible once it reached advanced stages, and even patients who stopped consuming the substance showed little improvement in their cognitive functioning. The few treatments that showed any promise required immediate intervention during the earlier stages of absinthe use, before significant neurological damage had occurred. This therapeutic pessimism provided additional support for prohibition advocates, who argued that prevention was the only realistic approach to the absinthe crisis. If medical science could not effectively treat absinthism once it developed, then the only rational policy was to prevent people from developing the condition in the first place by eliminating access to the substance entirely. The legal system struggled to adapt to the unique challenges posed by absinthe-related crimes. Traditional concepts of criminal responsibility assumed that defendants could distinguish between right and wrong and control their behavior through rational decision-making. However, chronic absinthe users often committed serious crimes while genuinely believing they were acting in self-defense or protecting innocent people from imaginary threats. French courts began grappling with cases where defendants could provide detailed, internally consistent explanations for their actions that revealed sophisticated reasoning abilities while being based on completely false premises about reality. These individuals weren't insane in the traditional sense, but they weren't fully responsible for their actions either, creating unprecedented legal and ethical dilemmas. The landmark case involved Philippe Moreau, a respected physician who had killed 2 patients during what he believed was a surgical procedure to remove parasitic demons that were feeding on their internal organs. Moreau's detailed medical records of the procedures demonstrated sophisticated anatomical knowledge and careful attention to sterile technique, but they were based on hallucinations that had no basis in reality. Moreau's case highlighted the inadequacy of existing legal frameworks for dealing with absinthe-related crimes. He was clearly dangerous and could not be released into society, but he also wasn't criminally responsible in the traditional sense, since his actions were based on genuine, if delusional, beliefs about protecting his patients from supernatural threats. The courts eventually developed a new legal category specifically for absinthe-related crimes, recognizing that these cases required different approaches than traditional criminal prosecution. This legal innovation reflected growing recognition that absinthe had created entirely new forms of human behavior that existing social institutions were not equipped to handle. The military implications of widespread absinthe consumption were becoming increasingly concerning to French defense officials. Medical examinations of military recruits revealed that significant numbers of young men showed early signs of absinthism that would make them unfit for military service. The prospect of an entire generation of French men being incapacitated by absinthe consumption posed obvious national security risks. General Ferdinand Foch, who would later become one of the key architects of Allied victory in World War I, privately warned government officials that absinthe represented a greater threat to French military readiness than any foreign enemy. He commissioned studies showing that absinthe consumption among soldiers led to increased rates of desertion, insubordination, and accidental injuries during training exercises. The military's concerns carried enormous political weight because of France's tense relations with neighboring countries and the growing possibility of armed conflict. Government officials who might have been willing to tolerate absinthe consumption as a civilian matter became much more receptive to prohibition when presented with evidence that the substance was undermining national defense capabilities. The international arms race that was building toward World War I made military preparedness a paramount concern for all European governments. France could not afford to have its military effectiveness compromised by a psychoactive substance that was entirely optional for national survival and prosperity. The children of chronic absinthe users presented another category of victims that prohibition advocates used to build support for their cause. Medical examinations revealed that children born to absinthe-consuming parents showed higher rates of developmental abnormalities, learning disabilities, and behavioral problems that appeared to be directly related to their parents' substance use. Dr. Anton Lassagne conducted the first systematic study of children from absinthe-using families, documenting patterns of cognitive and emotional development that were distinctly different from those of children from non-using families. These children showed delayed language acquisition, difficulty with abstract reasoning, and unusual sensitivity to sensory stimulation that suggested their nervous systems had been affected by their parents' absinthe consumption. The mechanism by which parental absinthe use affected children was not fully understood, but the statistical correlation was unmistakable.
Correlations were undeniable. Children from absinthe-using families were 3 times more likely to require special educational services, 4 times more likely to exhibit violent behavior, and 5 times more likely to develop substance abuse problems themselves during adolescence. These findings provided emotional ammunition for prohibition advocates who argued that absinthe consumption was not just an individual choice, but a form of child abuse that condemned innocent young people to lives of cognitive impairment and social dysfunction. The idea that adults had the right to consume dangerous substances became much more controversial when evidence showed that their choices were harming their children. The feminist movement's relationship with the absinthe debate was complex and often contradictory. Some women's rights advocates supported prohibition as a way to protect women from a substance that made them vulnerable to exploitation and violence. However, other feminists viewed absinthe regulation as paternalistic government interference that denied women the same freedoms that men enjoyed. The suffrage movement found itself split on the absinthe question, with some leaders arguing that women's political participation was essential to addressing public health crises like absinthism, while others maintained that focusing on substance abuse issues distracted from more fundamental questions about women's legal and economic equality. Marie Curie, who was beginning to establish her scientific reputation during this period, published several papers on the neurological effects of various chemical compounds that indirectly addressed the absinthe controversy. Her research suggested that the botanical compounds in absinthe could indeed cause permanent brain damage, lending scientific credibility to prohibition arguments without explicitly endorsing specific policy recommendations. The educational implications of the absinthe crisis were becoming increasingly apparent as teachers reported growing numbers of students who showed signs of cognitive impairment related to family absinthe consumption. Children from absinthe-using households had difficulty concentrating, following instructions, and interacting appropriately with classmates and teachers. School administrators began developing specialized programs to address the educational needs of these affected children, but the resources required were enormous and the outcomes were often disappointing.
Many children seemed to improve somewhat when removed from absinthe-using environments, but others showed persistent deficits that appeared to be permanent. The French educational system, which prided itself on producing some of the world's most accomplished intellectuals and artists, was being undermined by a substance that was destroying the cognitive development of an entire generation. This threat to France's educational excellence provided another compelling argument for immediate prohibition. The economic costs of the absinthe crisis were beginning to dwarf any benefits that the industry provided to the French economy. Healthcare expenses for treating absinthism were consuming increasingly large portions of municipal budgets, while productivity losses from absinthe-impaired workers were reducing economic output across multiple industries. A comprehensive economic analysis commissioned by the Ministry of Finance revealed that the total social cost of absinthe consumption exceeded the economic benefits by a factor of nearly 10 to 1. The study included not just direct medical expenses, but also lost productivity, increased crime rates, educational interventions for affected children, and the social services required to support families destroyed by absinthe addiction. These economic calculations provided powerful ammunition for prohibition advocates who could demonstrate that absinthe was not just a public health crisis, but an economic disaster that was draining resources from more productive uses. Even politicians who were philosophically opposed to government regulation found it difficult to argue against prohibition when presented with such compelling financial evidence. The tourism industry, which had initially benefited from international fascination with Parisian absinthe culture, was beginning to suffer as reports of absinthe-related violence and madness spread throughout Europe and America. Wealthy tourists were increasingly reluctant to visit Paris, fearing that they might become victims of absinthe-crazed criminals or accidentally consume the dangerous substance themselves. Hotel occupancy rates in Paris had declined significantly, and restaurant owners reported that international visitors were specifically requesting establishments that did not serve absinthe. The substance that had once been a symbol of Parisian sophistication was becoming a liability that was driving away the foreign tourists who were essential to the city's economy. The cultural implications of potential absinthe prohibition were perhaps the most difficult for French society to confront. Absinthe had become so deeply embedded in French artistic and intellectual life that eliminating it would require fundamental changes in how creative communities organize their social and professional activities. The ritual of absinthe consumption had evolved into something far more significant than simple recreational drinking. It was a form of cultural expression that connected contemporary artists to historical traditions, a social institution that facilitated collaborative creative work, and a symbol of French resistance to bourgeois conformity that had international significance. Many French intellectuals genuinely believed that prohibiting absinthe would diminish France's cultural vitality and artistic leadership. They argued that the creative breakthroughs achieved during the Belle Époque were inseparable from the altered consciousness that absinthe provided, and that eliminating the substance would reduce French art to conventional mediocrity. However, the mounting evidence of absinthe's destructive effects was making these cultural arguments increasingly difficult to sustain. How could French society justify preserving a tradition that was literally destroying the minds of its most talented citizens? What kind of cultural heritage was worth the systematic destruction of human consciousness that absinthe was causing? The philosophical questions raised by the absinthe crisis extended far beyond issues of public health or economic policy to fundamental questions about the nature of consciousness, creativity, and human flourishing. French intellectuals were forced to confront uncomfortable truths about the relationship between artistic achievement and psychological suffering that challenged romantic notions about the tortured artist whose pain produced transcendent beauty. The year 1909 would prove to be decisive in resolving these complex questions. As political pressure for action reached levels that could no longer be ignored, the convergence of medical evidence, economic analysis, international pressure, and public opinion had created conditions where comprehensive government intervention was not just possible, but inevitable. The only remaining question was what form that intervention would take, and whether it would be sufficient to address the crisis that absinthe had created in the heart of European civilization. The answer would determine not just the fate of a single psychoactive substance, but the future direction of French culture and society itself. The crisis reached its breaking point in the spring of 1909, when a single incident crystallized all the fears and anxieties that had been building around absinthe consumption. The Café de la Paix, one of Paris's most prestigious establishments, became the scene of what newspapers would later call the Green Fairy Massacre, an event so shocking that it would forever change how French society viewed the emerald-colored spirit that had once been its pride and joy. It began as an ordinary Tuesday evening in May. The café was filled with its usual clientele, wealthy businessmen conducting deals over elaborate dinners, fashionable couples celebrating engagements, and groups of artists and writers engaged in passionate debates about literature and politics. The atmosphere was refined and civilized, exactly what visitors expected from one of Paris's most celebrated dining establishments. Among the patrons that evening was Etienne Bohemian, a successful textile merchant who had built his fortune through careful attention to detail and conservative business practices. Bohemian was not part of the artistic bohemian scene that made absinthe famous, but like many respectable middle-class Parisians, he had developed the habit of concluding his business dinners with the elaborate ritual of absinthe consumption. For 3 years, Bohemian had been a moderate but regular absinthe drinker, consuming perhaps 2 or 3 glasses per week during social occasions. His family and business associates had never observed any concerning behaviors, and Bohemian himself believed that his occasional absinthe use was both harmless and sophisticated. He took pride in his collection of antique absinthe spoons and his knowledge of proper preparation techniques. But on this particular evening, something went catastrophically wrong. Witnesses later described how Bohemian's demeanor began to change after his second glass of absinthe, becoming increasingly agitated and paranoid. He started making accusations against other diners, claiming they were staring at him with malicious intent. The maitre d' attempted to calm him, but Bohemian became convinced that the entire staff was part of an elaborate conspiracy against him. What happened next defied all rational explanation. Bohemian suddenly stood up and began attacking other patrons with a carving knife he had seized from a nearby serving cart. His assault was not random violence.
Seemed to follow a twisted internal logic. He specifically targeted well-dressed individuals whom he apparently believed were part of the conspiracy he had imagined. The attack lasted only minutes, but the carnage was horrific. 3 people were killed outright, including a prominent banker and a celebrated opera singer who had been dining with her family. 7 others sustained serious injuries before other patrons and staff members could subdue Beaumont. Throughout the struggle, he continued screaming about invisible enemies and supernatural threats that existed only in his absinthe-distorted perception of reality. The medical examination that followed revealed the full extent of absinthe's insidious effects on Beaumont's mind. Despite appearing completely normal to everyone around him, he had been experiencing progressive neurological deterioration for months. His brain showed the same patterns of cellular damage that Dr. Risher had documented in his laboratory studies, concentrated in regions responsible for reality testing and impulse control. Most shocking of all, Beaumont had no memory of the attack and genuinely could not understand why he was being held responsible for the deaths and injuries. His damaged brain had completely erased the violent episode from his consciousness, while leaving his other cognitive functions relatively intact.
He could still perform complex mathematical calculations and discuss business matters with perfect clarity, but he had lost the ability to distinguish between his hallucinations and actual events. The Café de la Massacre became front-page news across Europe and America, sparking international outrage about France's failure to address the absinthe crisis. Foreign governments that had been privately pressuring France to take action now issued public statements condemning French authorities for allowing such a dangerous substance to remain freely available to the public. The British Parliament held emergency sessions to debate whether British citizens should be advised to avoid traveling to France entirely, given the apparent risk of encountering absinthe-crazed individuals in public places. The American State Department issued travel warnings describing Paris as potentially unsafe for tourists due to widespread absinthe consumption among the local population. These international reactions hit French national pride where it hurt most. The country that had positioned itself as the pinnacle of civilization and cultural sophistication was being portrayed as a dangerous place where ordinary citizens could transform into homicidal maniacs without warning. The economic implications were immediate and devastating as hotel bookings plummeted and international business conferences began relocating to other cities. The French medical establishment responded to the Café de la Massacre with unprecedented unity in calling for immediate prohibition. The Academy of Medicine held an emergency session where speaker after speaker presented evidence of absinthe's dangers, culminating in a unanimous resolution demanding government action. Dr. Paul Bouad-Delal, one of France's most respected physicians, declared that continued inaction would make government officials complicit in future tragedies. The scientific evidence presented at this emergency session was more comprehensive and damning than anything previously assembled. Researchers had now documented over 1,500 cases of severe absinthism, with symptoms ranging from persistent hallucinations to complete personality disintegration. The consistency of these symptoms across different social classes and geographic regions proved that the problems were caused by absinthe itself, rather than underlying mental illness or social conditions. New research techniques had revealed that absinthe's effects on the brain were even more severe than previously understood. The thujone compounds didn't just cause temporary intoxication, but actually altered the physical structure of neurons, creating permanent changes in how the brain processed information. These modifications accumulated over time, explaining why moderate users like Beaumont could appear normal for years before suddenly experiencing complete psychological collapse. The neurological mechanism was now understood in sufficient detail to predict the progression of absinthism with disturbing accuracy. Dr. Henry Clark had developed a staging system that could identify early signs of brain damage months before behavioral symptoms became apparent. His research showed that virtually all regular absinthe users would eventually develop some degree of neurological impairment, with the only variable being how long the process would take. This predictive capability transformed the debate from questions about individual choice to issues of public safety. If medical science could demonstrate that absinthe consumption inevitably led to brain damage and potentially violent behavior, then society had both the right and the obligation to protect innocent people from the consequences of other substance use. The artistic community's response to the Café de la Massacre revealed the deep fault lines that had been developing within creative circles for years. The younger generation of artists, led by figures like Pablo Picasso and Georges Braque, initially defended absinthe as essential to their creative process and dismissed the massacre as an isolated incident that shouldn't influence broader policy decisions. However, older and more established artists began breaking ranks in unprecedented numbers. Auguste Renoir published an open letter calling for immediate prohibition, arguing that no artistic benefits could justify the risk of innocent people being murdered by absinthe-crazed individuals. Auguste Monet organized a petition signed by over 200 prominent artists supporting government action to ban the substance entirely. The generational divide within the artistic community reflected deeper philosophical differences about the relationship between art and social responsibility. Younger artists viewed their absinthe consumption as a form of rebellion against bourgeois values and dismissed any regulation as an attack on artistic freedom. Older and more established artists who had witnessed absinthe's destructive effects firsthand were more willing to acknowledge that individual creative expression could not supersede collective safety concerns. This artistic civil war played out in the pages of newspapers and literary magazines, with passionate arguments on both sides that revealed how deeply absinthe had penetrated French cultural identity. Absinthe wasn't just a drink, it was a symbol of everything that made Paris the cultural capital of the world, and eliminating it would require fundamental changes in how French society understood itself. The economic arguments against prohibition were becoming increasingly desperate as the social costs of absinthe consumption continued to escalate. The industry commissioned new studies attempting to demonstrate that absinthe-related problems were caused by poverty, poor education, or underlying mental illness, rather than the substance itself. These efforts were largely unsuccessful because the evidence of direct causation had become overwhelming. Insurance companies had effectively withdrawn from any business related to absinthe consumption, making it impossible for cafés, distilleries, or distributors to obtain coverage for their operations. Banks were refusing to extend credit to absinthe-related businesses, and investors were fleeing the industry as quickly as possible. The economic collapse of the industry was proceeding faster than any political process, making their opposition to prohibition increasingly irrelevant to the actual survival of their members' livelihoods. Union leaders began negotiating with government officials about retraining programs and economic assistance for displaced workers, effectively conceding that prohibition was inevitable while trying to minimize the economic hardship for their members. This shift in union strategy removed one of the most powerful political obstacles to government action. The religious establishment's response to the Café de la Massacre was swift and uncompromising. The Catholic Church issued official statements describing absinthe as an instrument of evil that corrupted both individual souls and society as a whole. Cardinal Richard of Paris delivered a sermon comparing absinthe consumption to devil worship, arguing that the substance opened human minds to demonic influences that could transform ordinary people into instruments of supernatural malevolence. These religious condemnations carried enormous political weight in a country where Catholic voters represented a significant portion of the electorate. Conservative politicians who had previously been reluctant to support prohibition now began voicing support for immediate action, understanding that the issue had become a crucial vote-getter among traditional Catholics.
Prohibition on economic grounds found it increasingly difficult to oppose measures that had such strong religious backing. The Protestant churches, while less influential in France, also issued statements supporting prohibition based on their observations of absinthe's effects in other European countries. The rare unity between Catholic and Protestant religious leaders on the absinthe question created a powerful moral coalition that made prohibitions seem not just politically expedient, but morally necessary. The international diplomatic pressure on France intensified dramatically following the Café de la Massacre. The German government, which had been competing with France for cultural and political leadership in Europe, began using French absinthe consumption as evidence that French civilization was declining into decadence and barbarism. Kaiser Wilhelm II made several public comments suggesting that Germany's restrictions on absinthe consumption demonstrated superior German discipline and moral character compared to French self-indulgence and weakness. These statements infuriated French nationalists who viewed absinthe regulation as essential to defending French honor against German propaganda.
The British government took a more diplomatic approach, but made it clear that France's handling of the absinthe crisis would influence broader Anglo-French relations at a time when both countries were trying to build alliances against growing German power. The implication was that France's international credibility was at stake in how it responded to the absinthe problem. American officials were even more direct in their criticism, with President William Howard Taft publicly stating that the United States could not consider France a reliable partner in international affairs, while French society was being systematically poisoned by absinthe consumption. These comments created a diplomatic crisis that required immediate attention from the highest levels of the French government. The military implications of the absinthe crisis had become impossible to ignore as European tensions continued to escalate toward what would become World War I. French military commanders were reporting increasing problems with soldiers who showed signs of absinthe-related cognitive impairment, including difficulty following orders, poor judgment in dangerous situations, and unpredictable emotional reactions under stress. General Joseph Joffre, who would later lead French forces during the early years of World War I, conducted confidential assessments showing that absinthe consumption was undermining military readiness across all branches of the armed services. Soldiers with histories of regular absinthe use were more likely to desert, more prone to accidents during training, and less capable of performing complex tasks that required sustained concentration. The prospect of fighting a major war with an army that had been weakened by absinthe consumption was terrifying to French military leaders, who understood that national survival might depend on the efficiency and reliability of French soldiers. Military arguments for prohibition carried special weight because they connected absinthe regulation directly to national security concerns. Intelligence reports suggested that German military planners were actually counting on French absinthe consumption to weaken French military effectiveness in any future conflict. The idea that France's own cultural traditions were being exploited by potential enemies added urgency to calls for immediate government action. The legal system's struggle to handle absinthe-related crimes was becoming increasingly chaotic, as cases like the Café de la Massacre challenged fundamental assumptions about criminal responsibility and mental competence. Traditional legal concepts assumed that defendants could understand the consequences of their actions and control their behavior through rational decision-making processes. However, absinthe users often committed serious crimes while genuinely believing they were acting rationally to protect themselves or others from threats that existed only in their damaged minds. These individuals weren't legally insane in the traditional sense because they retained most of their cognitive abilities, but they also weren't fully responsible for actions based on completely false perceptions of reality. French courts were forced to develop entirely new legal frameworks for dealing with absinthe-related crimes, creating precedents that would influence criminal law throughout Europe. The concept of diminished responsibility due to substance-induced brain damage represented a revolutionary change in how legal systems understood the relationship between individual choice and criminal behavior. The complexity of these legal issues provided additional support for prohibition advocates, who argued that preventing absinthe consumption was simpler and more effective than trying to adapt the entire legal system to accommodate the unique problems created by absinthe-related crimes. The educational impact of the absinthe crisis was becoming increasingly apparent as teachers reported growing numbers of students whose learning abilities had been compromised by parental absinthe consumption. These children showed consistent patterns of cognitive impairment that made traditional educational approaches ineffective and required specialized interventions that strained school resources. Dr. Alfred Binet, who was pioneering the development of intelligence testing, conducted studies showing that children from absinthe-using families scored significantly lower on cognitive assessments than their peers from non-using families. The differences were most pronounced in areas requiring abstract reasoning, sustained attention, and emotional regulation, exactly the capabilities that were most important for academic success. The implications for France's educational system were staggering. If an entire generation of French children was being cognitively impaired by their parents' absinthe consumption, the country's intellectual and cultural leadership would inevitably decline over time. The prospect of France falling behind other nations due to substance-induced cognitive damage among its youth created powerful incentives for immediate government intervention. Educational reformers who had previously focused on curriculum changes and teaching methods began advocating for prohibition as the most effective way to protect children's intellectual development. Their arguments carried special weight because they were based on empirical evidence rather than moral or political considerations. The medical profession's unity in supporting prohibition was unprecedented in French history. Professional medical associations that normally disagreed about treatment approaches and research priorities were unanimous in their conclusion that absinthe posed unacceptable risks to public health that could only be addressed through complete prohibition. The French Academy of Medicine published a comprehensive report documenting over 3,000 cases of absinthism treated in French hospitals during the previous 5 years. The consistency of symptoms across different regions and social classes provided overwhelming evidence that absinthe itself, rather than underlying social or psychological factors, was responsible for the epidemic of neurological damage being observed throughout French society. International medical conferences were increasingly focused on the absinthe crisis as physicians from other countries sought to understand and prevent similar problems in their own populations. French medical researchers found themselves in the awkward position of being world experts on a public health disaster that their own government had failed to address effectively. The scientific reputation of French medicine was beginning to suffer as international colleagues questioned how a country with such advanced medical knowledge could continue to allow mass consumption of a substance that was clearly causing widespread brain damage. Professional pride became another factor, pushing French physicians toward increasingly militant advocacy for immediate prohibition. The pharmaceutical industry's attempts to develop treatments for absinthism had largely failed, reinforcing arguments that prevention through prohibition was the only realistic approach to the crisis. Companies that had invested heavily in research aimed at reversing absinthe-induced brain damage were forced to acknowledge that the neurological changes appeared to be irreversible once they reached advanced stages. The few treatments that showed any promise required intervention during the earlier stages of absinthe use, before significant brain damage had occurred. However, the gradual and often hidden nature of absinthe's effects on human consciousness, unlike other forms of substance abuse that users eventually recognized as problematic, absinthe seemed to damage the very brain functions that would normally motivate people to seek help, creating a vicious cycle where those who most needed treatment were least likely to recognize their condition. The women's rights movement found itself deeply divided over the absinthe question, as feminist leaders struggled to balance concerns about women's autonomy with growing evidence of the substance's
Dangers. Some feminist organizations supported prohibition as a way to protect women from a substance that made them vulnerable to exploitation and violence, while others viewed regulation as paternalistic interference that denied women the same freedoms that men enjoyed. The case of Marguerite Steinhall had become a rallying point for feminists who argued that absinthe consumption was particularly dangerous for women because it undermined their ability to protect themselves from male aggression. They pointed to increasing reports of sexual assault and domestic violence involving absinthe-impaired women as evidence that the substance posed unique risks to female safety. However, other feminist voices argued that focusing on absinthe regulation distracted from more fundamental issues of women's legal and economic inequality. They maintained that women's vulnerability to substance-related problems was primarily a result of their limited options and social power, rather than inherent female weakness that required special protection. The feminist debate over absinthe reflected broader tensions within the women's rights movement about whether women should be treated as equal to men in all respects, or whether gender differences require different approaches to social policy.
This philosophical divide would continue to influence feminist thought long after the absinthe crisis had been resolved. The cultural implications of potential prohibition extended far beyond the immediate question of substance regulation to fundamental issues about the nature of French identity and values. Absinthe had become so deeply embedded in French artistic and intellectual life that eliminating it would require reimagining what it meant to be part of French cultural tradition. The ritual aspects of absinthe consumption had evolved into elaborate ceremonies that connected contemporary French society to historical traditions and cultural values. The careful preparation of absinthe, with its specialized equipment and precise techniques, represented a form of cultural knowledge that had been passed down through generations and had become part of France's intangible heritage. Many French intellectuals genuinely feared that prohibition of absinthe would mark the beginning of a broader cultural decline, where France would lose the creative vitality and intellectual courage that had made it the cultural capital of Europe. They argued that the substance had played an essential role in the artistic achievements of the Belle Époque, and that eliminating it would reduce French culture to conventional mediocrity. However, the mounting evidence of absinthe's destructive effects was making these cultural arguments increasingly difficult to sustain in the face of scientific evidence and public safety concerns. The question was no longer whether absinthe had cultural value, but whether that value was worth the systematic destruction of human minds that continued absinthe consumption would inevitably cause. The international reputation of French culture was also at stake, as reports of absinthe-related violence and madness spread throughout Europe and America. Foreign observers who had once viewed Paris as the pinnacle of civilization and sophistication were beginning to see French absinthe culture as evidence of decadence and social decay. This shift in international perception threatened France's cultural soft power at a time when European nations were competing for global influence and prestige. The country that had given the world the Enlightenment, the Declaration of the Rights of Man, and countless artistic masterpieces was in danger of becoming synonymous with substance-induced madness and violence. The economic calculations surrounding prohibition were becoming increasingly complex as the true costs of absinthe consumption became apparent. While the industry generated significant tax revenue and employment, the social costs of treating absinthism, dealing with absinthe-related crimes, and supporting families destroyed by the substance far exceeded any economic benefits. A comprehensive cost-benefit analysis commissioned by the Ministry of Finance revealed that every franc generated by absinthe sales was offset by nearly 15 francs in social costs, making the industry a massive drain on public resources rather than a contributor to economic growth. These calculations included not just direct medical expenses, but also lost productivity, increased crime rates, educational interventions, and social services for affected families. The tourism industry, which had initially benefited from international fascination with Parisian absinthe culture, was experiencing dramatic declines in revenue as foreign visitors became reluctant to travel to a city associated with substance-induced violence. Hotel occupancy rates had fallen by over 30%, and restaurant owners reported that international customers were specifically avoiding establishments that served absinthe. The economic case for prohibition was becoming overwhelming, as even business leaders who had previously opposed government regulation acknowledged that absinthe consumption was destroying more economic value than it created. The invisible hand of the market was pointing toward prohibition even before government intervention forced the issue. The scientific understanding of absinthe's effect had reached a level of sophistication that made continued inaction increasingly difficult to justify on intellectual grounds. Researchers had identified the specific neurological mechanisms through which absinthe damaged human brains, predicted the progression of symptoms with remarkable accuracy, and demonstrated that the effects were irreversible once they reached advanced stages. The thujan compounds in absinthe were now known to bind to specific receptor sites in the brain that controlled both sensory processing and executive function, creating a neurochemical cascade that enhanced certain perceptions while progressively destroying the brain's ability to interpret those perceptions rationally. This understanding explained both absinthe's initial appeal and its ultimate destructiveness. The accumulation of scientific evidence had eliminated virtually all reasonable doubt about absinthe's dangers, making opposition to prohibition increasingly dependent on non-scientific arguments about individual freedom, cultural tradition, or economic concerns. The medical case for prohibition was as strong as the scientific evidence for any public health intervention in human history. The international scientific community was watching France's handling of the absinthe crisis as a test case for how modern nations should respond to public health emergencies involving psychoactive substances. The precedent set by French policy decisions would influence similar debates in other countries for decades to come. The year 1910 would mark the final chapter in the absinthe saga, as all the scientific, economic, cultural, and political forces that had been building for over a decade finally converged to force decisive government action. The only question remaining was whether French authorities would act quickly enough to prevent further tragedies like the Café de la Mare massacre, or whether additional horrors would be required to overcome the remaining political obstacles to prohibition. The pressure reached a boiling point when Dr. Auguste Forel from Switzerland published his groundbreaking comparative study in early 1910. Forel had been tracking the neurological effects of absinthe across multiple European populations, and his findings were more devastating than anyone had anticipated. What made his research particularly compelling was that he had studied identical twins, where one twin consumed absinthe regularly while the other remained abstinent. The brain scans revealed shocking differences between the twins after just 18 months of divergent substance use. The absinthe-consuming twins showed measurable shrinkage in specific brain regions, particularly areas responsible for impulse control and reality testing. Even more disturbing, these changes appeared to be accelerating rather than stabilizing, suggesting that the damage would continue worsening as long as consumption continued. Forel's twin studies eliminated the last scientific arguments that absinthe's effects might be due to underlying genetic predispositions or environmental factors. Here was definitive proof that the substance itself was directly causing irreversible brain damage in otherwise healthy individuals. The implications were staggering because they suggested that millions of Europeans were unknowingly destroying their own minds through what they believed was harmless social drinking. The medical establishment across Europe reacted to Forel's findings with unprecedented alarm. The Royal College of Physicians in London issued an emergency statement warning that absinthe consumption represented the greatest threat to human neurological health in recorded medical history. German physicians published similar warnings, while Italian medical journals began referring to absinthe as liquid insanity. What made the situation even more urgent was Forel's discovery that the brain damage began much earlier than previously understood. Even moderate users, who consumed absinthe only occasionally, showed measurable neurological changes within 6 months of their first exposure. This meant that virtually everyone who had ever tried absinthe was potentially at risk, regardless of how carefully they monitored their consumption. The psychological mechanism behind absinthe's predictive properties was finally understood through Forel's research. The substance didn't just create physical dependency like alcohol or morphine, but actually rewired the brain's reward systems to make normal consciousness feel incomplete and unsatisfying. Users weren't just craving the substance, their damaged brains had lost the ability to experience pleasure or creativity without chemical enhancement. This neurological dependency explained why absinthe eventually destroyed the creative spirit it itself initially inspired. Creativity would now require escalation of chemical stimulation as natural inspiration became.
Why so many intelligent, educated people continued using absinthe despite obvious signs of deterioration? Their brains had been fundamentally altered to require the substance for basic emotional and cognitive functioning, making voluntary abstinence virtually impossible once the addiction had established itself. The French government found itself facing an impossible situation as international pressure mounted while domestic opposition to prohibition remained fierce. President Armand Fallières privately acknowledged that absinthe posed an existential threat to French society, but publicly maintained that any regulatory changes would require extensive consultation with affected industries and cultural institutions. Behind closed doors, government officials were receiving increasingly desperate reports from hospital administrators who were running out of space to house absinthe-related patients. The public health system was being overwhelmed by the sheer volume of people requiring treatment for various forms of absinthism, from mild cognitive impairment to complete psychotic breakdown. The military situation was becoming equally critical, as recruitment officers reported that nearly 40% of potential conscripts showed some signs of absinthe-related neurological damage. The prospect of defending France with an army of cognitively impaired soldiers was terrifying to military commanders, who understood that European war was becoming increasingly likely. Intelligence reports suggested that German military planners were actually encouraging French absinthe consumption through covert propaganda campaigns designed to weaken French military capabilities. The idea that France's cultural traditions were being exploited by potential enemies added a national security dimension to what had previously been viewed as a domestic health issue. The economic arguments for prohibition were becoming overwhelming as the true scope of absinthe's social costs became apparent. Insurance companies had calculated that absinthe-related claims were costing the French economy over 200 million francs annually, a sum that exceeded the total revenue generated by the entire absinthe industry by a factor of 8. Banking institutions were reporting increasing defaults on loans to businesses and individuals whose economic productivity had been compromised by absinthe consumption. The substance was creating a cascade of economic disruption that extended far beyond the immediate health costs to affected individuals and their families. The labor movement's position on absinthe had shifted dramatically as union leaders recognized that substance-impaired workers were more vulnerable to industrial actions and economic exploitation. What had once been viewed as a worker's right to recreational intoxication was increasingly seen as a threat to workers' safety and economic security. Strike organizers reported that absinthe-using workers were less reliable participants in labor actions, more easily manipulated by management, and more likely to accept dangerous working conditions without protest. The substance that had once been associated with artistic rebellion was actually undermining the working-class solidarity that was essential to effective labor organizing. The international diplomatic consequences of France's absinthe crisis were escalating beyond mere criticism to actual economic sanctions. Several American states had banned not just absinthe imports, but all French alcoholic beverages, citing concerns about French quality control and public health standards. British merchants were demanding such extensive testing and certification for French exports that many producers found it economically impossible to maintain their international markets. The reputation damage was spreading beyond absinthe to affect France's entire export economy, threatening industries that had no connection to the controversial substance. The German government was using French absinthe consumption as propaganda evidence that French civilization was declining into decadence and moral corruption. Kaiser Wilhelm II made increasingly pointed comments about German cultural and moral superiority, using absinthe as a symbol of everything that was wrong with French society. These international humiliations were particularly galling to French nationalists, who viewed their country's cultural achievements as central to national identity and international prestige. The idea that France was being mocked and marginalized because of a single psychoactive substance created powerful political pressure for immediate government action. The artistic community's internal divisions over absinthe were becoming increasingly acrimonious as the evidence of the substance's dangers accumulated. Younger artists who continued defending absinthe were being ostracized by their more established colleagues, creating professional and social tensions that were destroying creative collaborations and artistic institutions. The Société d'Artistes de France, one of the country's most prestigious artistic organizations, voted to expel any member who publicly advocated for continued absinthe consumption. This unprecedented action split the artistic establishment and forced many prominent figures to choose between their substance use and their professional associations. Pablo Picasso, who had been one of absinthe's most vocal defenders, quietly reduced his own consumption after several close friends experienced severe psychological breakdowns that appeared directly related to their absinthe use. However, he continued to oppose prohibition publicly, viewing any government regulation as an unacceptable constraint on artistic freedom. The generational divide within artistic circles was becoming increasingly pronounced as older artists who had witnessed absinthe's long-term effects became increasingly militant in their opposition to the substance. Auguste Rodin organized a group of senior artists who pledged to refuse collaboration with any younger artists who continued using absinthe regularly. This artistic civil war was particularly damaging because it was destroying the mentorship relationships and collaborative networks that had made Paris the center of European cultural innovation. The creative community that had produced some of history's greatest artistic achievements was being torn apart by disagreements over substance use. The religious establishment's response to the absinthe crisis was becoming increasingly sophisticated as church leaders developed theological arguments that went beyond simple moral condemnation. Catholic theologians began arguing that absinthe consumption represented a form of spiritual suicide that violated fundamental Christian teachings about the sanctity of human consciousness. Pope Pius X issued a papal encyclical specifically addressing the absinthe crisis, describing the substance as an instrument of Satan designed to corrupt the divine gift of human reason. This official church position carried enormous weight in a predominantly Catholic country and created irresistible pressure for Catholic politicians to support prohibition. Protestant churches throughout Europe followed with similar condemnations, creating rare ecumenical unity on a social policy issue. The theological argument that absinthe consumption violated religious obligations to preserve God-given mental faculties resonated powerfully with religious voters across denominational lines. The moral dimension of the absinthe debate was further complicated by growing evidence that the substance was being used to facilitate sexual assault and other violent crimes. Police reports documented increasing numbers of cases where absinthe had been used to incapacitate victims, or where perpetrators claimed absinthe-induced hallucinations as justification for their actions. The legal system struggle to handle these cases was creating public safety concerns that extended far beyond the immediate effects of absinthe consumption. Traditional concepts of criminal responsibility were breaking down as more defendants claimed diminished capacity due to substance-induced brain damage. French courts were forced to develop entirely new legal frameworks that distinguish between voluntary intoxication and involuntary neurological impairment caused by cumulative substance exposure. These legal innovations were being watched closely by jurists throughout Europe who were grappling with similar challenges in their own legal systems. The complexity of absinthe-related legal cases was creating enormous backlogs in the court system, while generating enormous costs for legal proceedings that often lasted months or years. The economic burden of processing these cases was becoming another hidden cost of continued absinthe consumption that society could no longer afford. The educational impact of the absinthe crisis was extending beyond immediate concerns about affected children to fundamental questions about France's intellectual future. University administrators reported declining academic performance among students from absinthe-using families, suggesting that the cognitive damage was affecting even the country's most privileged and educated youth. The École Normale Supérieure, France's most elite educational institution, conducted confidential assessments showing that students with histories of family absinthe exposure scored significantly lower than standardized examinations than their peers from non-using families. These differences were most pronounced in subjects requiring abstract reasoning and creative problem-solving, exactly the intellectual capabilities that were most important for future leadership positions. The implications for France's competitive position in science, technology, and culture were staggering. If an entire generation of French intellectuals was being cognitively impaired by their parents' substance use, the country would inevitably fall behind other nations in the global competition for scientific and cultural achievements.
Achievement. Educational reformers who had spent decades working to improve French schools were forced to acknowledge that their efforts were being undermined by a single psychoactive substance that was systematically damaging students' learning capabilities before they ever entered the classroom. The medical profession's understanding of absinthe effects had reached unprecedented sophistication through the development of new diagnostic techniques and research methodologies. Dr. Jean-Martin Charcot's students at the Salpêtrière Hospital were using innovative neurological assessments to identify absinthe-related brain damage in its earlier stages, often before users themselves were aware that their cognitive functioning had been compromised. These early detection methods revealed that the prevalence of absinthe-related neurological damage was far higher than previously understood. Population surveys suggested that over 30% of regular absinthe users showed measurable cognitive impairment, while even occasional users demonstrated subtle changes in brain function that could progress to more serious problems over time. The development of standardized diagnostic criteria for absinthism allowed for systematic comparison of cases across different regions and social groups. The consistency of symptoms and progression patterns provided overwhelming evidence that absinthe itself, rather than underlying a social or psychological factors, was responsible for the epidemic of neurological problems being observed throughout French society. International medical conferences were increasingly dominated by presentations on absinthe-related research, as physicians from other countries sought to understand and prevent similar problems in their own populations. French medical researchers found themselves reluctant experts on a public health disaster that was damaging their country's scientific reputation even as it advanced medical knowledge. The pharmaceutical industry's continued failure to develop effective treatments for absinthism was reinforcing arguments that prevention through prohibition was the only realistic approach to the crisis. Companies that had invested millions of francs in research aimed at reversing absinthe-induced brain damage were forced to acknowledge that the neurological changes appeared to be permanent once they reached advanced stages. The few experimental treatments that showed any promise required immediate intervention during the earlier stages of exposure before significant brain damage had occurred. However, the subtle and gradual nature of absinthe's effects meant that most users didn't recognize their condition until medical intervention could no longer reverse the damage. This therapeutic pessimism was particularly devastating for families dealing with absinthe-affected relatives who had become increasingly desperate for medical solutions to what they were finally recognizing as a serious health problem. The realization that their loved ones' conditions were essentially incurable was creating secondary psychological trauma that extended the social impact of the absinthe crisis. The failure of medical interventions also highlighted the cruel irony of absinthe's effects on human consciousness. The substance damaged the very brain functions that would normally motivate people to seek help, creating a vicious cycle where those who most needed treatment were least capable of recognizing their condition or cooperating with therapeutic interventions. The women's rights movement was becoming increasingly unified in supporting prohibition as evidence accumulated that absinthe consumption was particularly dangerous for women of childbearing age. Medical studies revealed that even moderate absinthe use during pregnancy could cause developmental abnormalities in children that persisted throughout their lives.
The feminist argument for prohibition was becoming more sophisticated as women's rights advocates argued that protecting female reproductive health was essential to advancing women's social and economic equality. They maintained that substance-induced cognitive impairment among women undermined efforts to demonstrate female intellectual capabilities and professional competence. However, a minority of feminist voices continued to argue that prohibition represented paternalistic government interference that treated women as incapable of making rational decisions about their own bodies and lives. These debates reflected deeper philosophical divisions within the women's rights movement about the relationship between individual autonomy and collective welfare. The discovery that absinthe exposure could affect unborn children provided prohibition advocates with their most emotionally compelling arguments about intergenerational justice and social responsibility. The idea that adult substance use choices were condemning innocent children to lives of cognitive impairment resonated powerfully across political and cultural lines. The cultural implications of potential prohibition were becoming more complex as French society grappled with fundamental questions about the relationship between artistic achievement and consciousness alteration. The romantic notion of the tortured artist, whose suffering produced transcendent beauty, was being challenged by scientific evidence that substance-induced suffering actually diminished rather than enhanced creative capabilities. Art historians were beginning to re-examine the artistic achievements of the Belle Époque period to determine whether absinthe had genuinely contributed to creative breakthroughs or simply created the illusion of enhanced creativity while actually limiting artistic development. These scholarly investigations were revealing that many celebrated works had been created during periods of sobriety rather than absinthe intoxication. The realization that absinthe might have hindered rather than helped artistic achievement was profoundly disturbing to French intellectuals who had built their identities around the mythology of chemically enhanced creativity. The possibility that their cultural heroes had succeeded despite rather than because of their substance use challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of artistic genius. International observers of French culture were increasingly viewing absinthe consumption as evidence of cultural decline rather than sophisticated artistic sensibility. The substance that had once symbolized Parisian creativity and intellectual courage was becoming associated with self-destructive decadence and social irresponsibility. The economic calculations surrounding prohibition were becoming increasingly precise as economists developed more sophisticated methods for measuring the social costs of substance abuse. The hidden expenses associated with absinthe consumption were far greater than anyone had previously understood, including reduced economic productivity, increased healthcare costs, higher crime rates, and diminished educational outcomes. A comprehensive economic impact study revealed that absinthe consumption was reducing French gross domestic product by approximately 3% annually, a staggering sum that exceeded the economic output of several smaller European countries. These calculations included not just direct costs, but also opportunity costs representing economic value that was never created due to substance-impaired human capital. The tourism industry's decline was accelerating as international visitors became increasingly reluctant to travel to a country associated with substance-induced violence and social disorder. Hotel operators reported that even business travelers were avoiding Paris when possible, preferring to conduct their affairs in cities that were perceived as safer and more stable. The reputational damage to French exports was spreading beyond alcoholic beverages to affect luxury goods, fashion, and cultural products that depended on France's image as a center of sophistication and refinement. The economic multiplier effects of the absinthe crisis were threatening industries that had no direct connection to the controversial substance. The scientific consensus supporting prohibition had become so overwhelming that continued governmental inaction was increasingly viewed as willful negligence of public health responsibilities. Medical journals throughout Europe were publishing editorials questioning whether French authorities were competent to govern a modern society, given their failure to address such a clear and present danger to public welfare. The international scientific community was beginning to view France as a cautionary example of how not to respond to public health emergencies involving psychoactive substances. The precedent being set by French policy decisions would influence similar debates in other countries for decades to come, making the stakes of the prohibition decision much larger than immediate domestic concerns. Research institutions in other countries were conducting their own studies of absinthe, generally confirming the French findings, while reaching even more alarming conclusions about the substance's dangers. The consistency of research results across different populations and methodologies had eliminated virtually all scientific doubt about the need for immediate intervention. The accumulation of scientific evidence had reached a point where opposition to prohibition was becoming intellectually untenable for anyone who accepted the validity of empirical research and evidence-based policymaking. The debate was shifting from questions about whether absinthe was dangerous to questions about how quickly and completely it should be eliminated from society. The year 1910 marked the final convergence of all the scientific, economic, cultural, and political forces that had been building around the absinthe crisis for over a decade. The only remaining question was whether French authorities would act decisively to prevent further tragedies, or whether they would allow the absinthe crisis to continue.
Additional catastrophes would be required to overcome the last vestiges of political resistance to prohibition. The mounting pressure from every sector of society, medical, economic, military, religious, educational, and cultural, had created conditions where continued inaction was becoming politically impossible, regardless of the economic costs or cultural disruption that prohibition might cause. The green fairy that had once symbolized Parisian sophistication and artistic achievement was about to become a casualty of its own destructive success in capturing the minds and souls of an entire generation. The tipping point came in the autumn of 1910 when a series of events unfolded with such devastating clarity that even the most ardent defenders of absinthe could no longer deny the inevitable. It began with what medical historians would later call the October Horror, a week-long period that saw 17 separate incidents of absinthe-related violence across Paris, each more disturbing than the last. The most shocking case involved Dr. Henri Moreau, a respected physician at the Hôpital Saint-Lô, who had been secretly consuming increasing quantities of absinthe for nearly 2 years. Moreau had managed to conceal his deteriorating condition from colleagues and patients alike, maintaining his professional duties with apparent competence even as his grip on reality steadily weakened. On October 12th, during what should have been a routine surgical procedure, Moreau became convinced that his patient's internal organs were infested with supernatural parasites that only he could see. Witnesses described how he began operating with increasingly frantic intensity, claiming he was saving the patient from demonic possession while actually causing massive internal trauma that would prove fatal. The operating theater descended into chaos as nurses and assistants tried to restrain Moreau, who continued insisting that invisible creatures were escaping from the patient's body and threatening everyone in the room. His detailed medical knowledge, combined with complete disconnection from reality, created a horrific spectacle that traumatized everyone present. When police finally subdued Moreau, they found his personal quarters filled with elaborate diagrams mapping what he believed was a vast conspiracy of supernatural entities that had infiltrated Paris through the water supply. His journals revealed months of increasingly paranoid observations about colleagues and patients whom he suspected of being possessed by the same demonic forces he claimed to be fighting. The Moreau case was particularly devastating because it demonstrated that absinthe's effects could remain hidden even in professions requiring the highest levels of cognitive precision and ethical responsibility.
If a respected physician could perform surgery while experiencing complete psychotic delusions, then no one could claim immunity from the substance's destructive influence. The medical establishment's response was swift and unprecedented. The French Medical Association held an emergency assembly where over 3,000 physicians voted unanimously for immediate and complete prohibition of all absinthe production and distribution. Dr. Gord Clemenceau, who would later become prime minister, declared that continued governmental inaction would make French authorities complicit in mass poisoning of the population. The psychological autopsies of absinthe users who had died during this period revealed brain damage patterns that exceeded even the most pessimistic medical predictions. Dr. Paul Sollier's team at the Boulogne-sur-Seine clinic discovered that chronic users were experiencing neurological deterioration at rates that were literally unprecedented in medical literature. The cellular destruction was so extensive that some patients' brains resembled those of individuals who had suffered massive strokes or severe traumatic injuries. Yet these individuals appeared relatively normal in social interactions, suggesting that absinthe was selectively destroying specific brain functions while leaving others temporarily intact. Most disturbing was the discovery that the brain damage was accelerating rather than stabilizing. Patients who had shown mild symptoms 6 months earlier were now exhibiting complete personality disintegration, suggesting that absinthe's effects followed an exponential rather than linear progression that made early intervention virtually useless. The international medical community reacted with horror to these findings. The German physician Rudolf Virchow, one of the founders of modern pathology, published an open letter declaring that absinthe represented the greatest neurological catastrophe in recorded medical history. British medical journals began referring to France as a nation in the grip of mass neurological suicide. American medical schools began using French absinthe cases as textbook examples of how psychoactive substances could destroy entire populations if governments failed to take appropriate regulatory action. The international medical community was essentially treating France as a living laboratory for studying the long-term effects of uncontrolled psychoactive substance abuse on a societal scale. The economic consequences of the October horror were immediate and severe. The Paris Stock Exchange experienced its worst single-day decline in over 20 years as international investors fled French securities. Foreign businesses began relocating their operations to other European cities, citing concerns about the reliability and safety of French workers and business partners. Insurance companies that had been gradually withdrawing from absinthe-related coverage now refused to provide any policies whatsoever to French businesses or individuals. Lloyd's of London announced that France had become uninsurable due to the unpredictable nature of absinthe-related incidents and the government's failure to address the crisis effectively. The tourism industry, which had been declining steadily for months, now faced complete collapse as foreign governments began issuing official travel warnings, advising their citizens to avoid France entirely. The American State Department classified Paris as a dangerous destination, comparable to regions experiencing active military conflict. Hotel occupancy rates fell below 20% as international conferences and cultural events relocated to other cities. The Exposition Universelle, scheduled for 1911, was quietly canceled as organizers acknowledged that no foreign participants would be willing to travel to Paris under current conditions. The military implications reached crisis levels when recruitment officers reported that over 60% of potential conscripts showed measurable signs of absinthe-related cognitive impairment. General Ferdinand Foch conducted classified assessments revealing that France's military readiness had been compromised to an extent that made the country vulnerable to invasion by any competently organized enemy force. Intelligence reports confirmed that German military planners were indeed counting on French absinthe consumption to weaken French defensive capabilities. Captured documents revealed detailed German assessments of how absinthe-related neurological damage was affecting French military personnel at every level of command. The prospect of defending French territory with an army composed largely of cognitively impaired soldiers was so terrifying that military commanders began privately discussing whether France should seek protective alliances with other powers rather than rely on its own defensive capabilities. The domestic political situation became increasingly unstable as public confidence in governmental competence reached historic lows. Riots broke out in several major cities as citizens demanded immediate action to protect their families from what they increasingly viewed as governmental negligence bordering on criminal conspiracy. The Socialist Party, which had previously opposed prohibition on grounds of individual liberty, reversed its position after party leaders recognized that absinthe consumption was systematically destroying the working-class consciousness that was essential to their political movement. Substance-impaired workers were proving incapable of organizing effective resistance to economic exploitation. Conservative politicians who had resisted prohibition due to economic concerns found themselves facing electoral annihilation as voters blamed them for the crisis that was destroying French society. The Catholic vote in particular was mobilizing around prohibition as a moral imperative that transcended traditional political divisions. President Armand Fallier found himself trapped between international humiliation and domestic political collapse. His administration's credibility had been so thoroughly undermined that foreign diplomats were beginning to question whether the French government possessed sufficient competence to honor its international obligations and treaty commitments. The cultural reckoning was equally devastating, as French intellectuals were forced to confront the possibility that their celebrated artistic achievements had been built on foundations of systematic self-destruction. The romantic mythology of absinthe-enhanced creativity was collapsing under the weight of scientific evidence that the substance actually diminished rather than enhanced human creative capabilities. Art critics began re-examining the masterpieces of the Belle Époque period, searching for evidence of whether these works had been created during periods of absinthe intoxication or sobriety. The emerging consensus suggested that the greatest artistic achievements had occurred despite, rather than because of, absinthe consumption, fundamentally challenging French cultural assumptions about the relationship between suffering and creativity. The Académie Française, France's most prestigious cultural institution, voted to expel any member who continued to
advocating for absinthe consumption after the October horror. This unprecedented action split the French intellectual establishment and forced many prominent figures to choose between their substance use and their cultural standing. International perceptions of French culture had shifted dramatically from admiration to pity, as foreign observers began viewing French absinthe consumption as evidence of cultural decline rather than sophisticated artistic sensibility. The country that had once been synonymous with intellectual achievement was becoming associated with self-destructive decadence. The religious establishment's response reached new levels of militancy as church leaders began organizing mass prayer vigils specifically focused on ending the absinthe crisis. Cardinal Aimé of Paris delivered sermons describing absinthe as Satan's final assault on Christian civilization, language that resonated powerfully with religious voters who were demanding immediate government intervention. The rare unity between Catholic and Protestant churches created unprecedented religious pressure for prohibition. Theological seminaries throughout Europe began teaching courses on the spiritual dangers of consciousness-altering substances, using French absinthe consumption as a cautionary example of how entire societies could fall into spiritual bondage. Religious leaders were particularly effective in mobilizing female voters who were increasingly viewing absinthe prohibition as essential to protecting their families from substance-induced violence and economic destruction. The women's auxiliary organizations of various churches became some of the most vocal and organized advocates for immediate government action.
The legal system's complete inability to process absinthe-related cases effectively had created a crisis of confidence in French jurisprudence that was undermining the rule of law itself. Courts were so backlogged with cases involving defendants whose mental competence was questionable that ordinary criminal proceedings were being delayed for months or years. The development of new legal frameworks for addressing substance-induced diminished capacity had created enormous complexity and uncertainty in criminal proceedings. Defense attorneys were increasingly successful in arguing that their clients could not be held responsible for actions committed while suffering from absinthe-induced brain damage. This legal chaos was creating a sense that French society was becoming ungovernable, as traditional mechanisms for maintaining social order broke down under the pressure of mass substance-induced cognitive impairment. Public confidence in the justice system reached historic lows as citizens lost faith in the government's ability to protect them from absinthe-related violence. The educational crisis was reaching catastrophic proportions as teachers reported that increasing numbers of students were arriving at school with cognitive deficits that made traditional instruction impossible. Children from absinthe-using families required specialized interventions that strained educational resources while producing disappointing results. University administrators were documenting dramatic declines in academic performance that correlated directly with family histories of absinthe consumption. The École Polytechnique, France's most elite engineering school, reported that students from absinthe-affected families were failing at rates that threatened the institution's academic standards. The implications for France's competitive position in science and technology were staggering. The country that had produced some of history's greatest scientific achievements was facing the prospect of intellectual decline that would make it impossible to compete with other nations in the emerging global economy. Educational reformers who had devoted their careers to improving French schools were forced to acknowledge that their efforts were being systematically undermined by a single psychoactive substance that was damaging students' learning capabilities before they ever entered the classroom. The medical profession's understanding of absinthe's effects had become so sophisticated that physicians could predict with remarkable accuracy how individual users' conditions would progress over time. This predictive capability made continued inaction seem like deliberate negligence of medical knowledge and professional responsibilities. And so, the Green Fair's reign of terror came to an end. On August 28, 1914, just weeks before the outbreak of World War I, France finally banned absinthe completely. By then, the damage was incalculable. An entire generation had been cognitively crippled, artistic communities destroyed, and French culture forever changed. The substance that had once symbolized Parisian sophistication became a cautionary tale about the dangers of prioritizing individual pleasure over collective survival. Today, as we face new challenges with consciousness-altering substances, the absinthe crisis reminds us that sometimes the most beautiful poisons are also the most deadly.